My name is Scott Appleby. I'm the director of the Joan B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. I want to welcome you to this special event. It's special not only because of our speaker and respondent, both of whom are distinguished scholars of peace studies, but because we have in attendance members of the Kroc Institute Advisory Council who are here for their meetings this weekend, and I want to welcome all of you. I've been able to greet some of you, and I know others are coming a little bit later to join us. We have today a real treat in that we have a presentation by the Starman Research Professor here at the Kroc Institute, Peter Wallensteen, and I'll introduce Peter in just a moment. And also we have a response by one of our visiting fellows this year, this semester at the Kroc Institute, Roger Mac Ginty. Let me introduce Roger first. Roger is a visiting fellow here at Kroc this semester. He holds a faculty position in the School of International Studies at St. Andrews University, Scotland. He earned a PhD in International Relations from Queen's University, Belfast, and he's collaborated with many of the scholars here, especially Professor John Darby, on the study of ethnic conflict, political violence, post-war reconstruction, conflict management, and comparative peace processes. We're particularly delighted that Roger's with us this semester to learn more about and contribute to the conversations about our Peace Accord Matrix Research Project that many of the council members heard about for the first time at the meeting last year. And Roger is helping us think about the next phases of that project. We'll be doing so more this semester. Professor Mac Ginty has conducted field research all over the world in Bosnia, Croatia, India, Jordan, Lebanon, Northern Ireland, and Sri Lanka. He's written a number of books and articles, most recently, International Peacebuilding and Local Resistance, Hybrid Forms of Peace. While he's here this semester and beyond, he's working on a new project which is continuous with a lot of the work he's been doing, but it's also fits very well with some of the initiatives we're taking here at Kroc. That is the idea of trying to develop indicators to measure peace, the progress towards sustainable peace, the existence of sustainable peace. What is a quality peace? What are the indices of peace? And Roger's taking the quite unconventional approach of actually asking people who are living in the communities affected by conflict what they think peace is about and what they think the indicators of peace are. This is, in some ways, perhaps an obvious thing to do, but how to do that, how to measure peace by consulting the people most affected by peace or its lack is something that's a challenge, but a very worthy and important project he's working on. Roger will speak in response to Peter, who will be delivering the main presentation today. Peter is the Dag Hammarskjöld Professor of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, Uppsala, Sweden, and more relevant for our purposes today, the Richard G. Starman Senior Research Professor of Peace Studies here at the Kroc Institute. Peter has been with us every fall since 2006, and the most important item on his CV is that he's married to Lena Wallensteen, who also joins us every fall to take about 3 or 4 important jobs while she's here that we need someone to take care of for us in terms of consultation and planning. Lena's a great asset as well. Peter has taught many courses in his career. For us, he teaches a very important course for our curricula, and it's a course on international peace research, origins, methodologies, and results that he's taught in the past for master's students, and now for some master's students and the PhD students are required to take this important foundational course. In addition to teaching at Notre Dame in Uppsala, Peter has also taught in Finland, Yugoslavia, Malaysia, Michigan, West Germany, and that country called Yale University. He is perhaps most known worldwide for being the director, leader, and really founder of the very important and impressive Uppsala Conflict Data Program in Sweden, which since its inception in 1979 has been the place to go to understand data, trends, patterns in conflict around the world. It really is an invaluable resource for peace researchers everywhere. He's the author of several books and articles, most recently, very important to our efforts here, a book entitled Peace Research, Theory and Practice, just out this year. Very recently as well, a book on the styles of mediation with Jan Eliasson, about Jan Eliasson, I should say, called The Go-Between, and then several important texts that are standards in the field, including Understanding Conflict Resolution, War, Peace, and the Global System, which is now in its 3rd edition, and also is written on third parties and conflict prevention. The presentation Peter's going to deliver to us today is taken from a forthcoming book that we will be happy to accept as a submission for our Kroc Institute series in strategic peacebuilding. And we're still working on a title of that manuscript, I think, but the title of the presentation today is a clue as to what it's about, and he'll say more about it now. The Narrow Path of Peacebuilding, Challenges and Remedies. Please join me in welcoming Peter Wallensteen.
Thank you very much, Scott. Those very nice words. I wish my wife was here as well, then I would feel more comfortable, but I'll try to do it on my own. The question that we are talking about today is peace building, and of course it is a topic that has been central for the Kroc Institute for many years, to think about peace building and strategic peace building in particular. I also think this is not just a theoretical or academic subject, it is really one which is very important for the world as a whole. As you all know, this week is the Nobel week. Various Nobel Prizes are handed out, and tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock Norwegian time, they will announce who will get the Peace Prize for this year. I'm sure the Kroc Institute is nominated. I have looked at the bookmakers, and it doesn't come up, but that could be a real dark horse. But one, one who definitely has been nominated is a woman from Liberia, and that is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She's the president of Liberia, and the idea with the nomination is that she has actually been implementing peace-building strategies in Liberia for the period after the war that ended in 2003. And one can see on various indices that Liberia is doing fairly well compared to other African states. So the topic is very pertinent, it's very important, and it is not an easy topic. So that's what I would like to illustrate here. That's why I call this the narrow path. It is not so easy to get the results you want. But the background then is this one. And this is drawn from what Scott mentioned, the conflict data program in Uppsala. And what you have here, oops. What you have here are two curves. So I'll explain what they are. This one are all the conflicts that we defined as minor armed conflict. That is conflicts where at least 25 people have been killed during a year in battles, up to 999, sort of arithmetic cutting point. And here are those that are wars. That is more than 1,000 people killed in a year. And these are, of course, the problems that we are interested in. We can see that for the whole Cold War, the number of conflicts increased constantly up to a peak around 1991-92. And the same for wars. It's about the same time that there is a peak. Then there is a bit of a reduction down to about 25 minor armed conflict and about 4 or 5 wars. So we have about 30 armed conflicts going on by the end of 2010. And when we look at 2011, of course, we definitely need to add Libya to the conflict patterns here. So it will probably be a little of an increase here. It all suggests then that maybe the world has become a little better at managing conflicts, preventing them from escalating. If we look over the period here, we can see that the gap between the two curves is sort of increasing. Fewer wars are emerging out of the armed conflicts. And I would suggest that that means we are getting better at prevention, managing, perhaps containing conflicts, but not necessarily solving them. And if we look at many of the conflicts that go on here in 2010, we can see that many of them have been on the agenda of the United Nations, of the world, for 5, 10, even longer periods of time. Tomorrow, for instance, is the day when the United States got involved in the Afghanistan war. That's exactly 10 years ago. Tomorrow, that's 10 years of conflict. Or the war in Iraq has been going on for 8 years. Some of the others that are in here would be, for instance, Somalia, been going on since the early 90s. So these are very protracted conflicts. And the problem is not just to stop them or contain them, it's also trying to find a way in which one can build a lasting peace after these conflicts. So that's why I try to figure out what is peace building then doing, and what is the plan, the idea with peace building. Well, first we need to know what scientists, us, as well as practitioners, think we know about these kind of situations. And I think we definitely know very little so far. So the fact that the Kroc Institute has put this on the agenda is an important thing. It requires, I think, further efforts. And there are quite a lot of writings of various sorts, but at integrating these into the whole, saying this is what we scientists, concerned people know, there is a lack of that, and this contribution tries to do something on this. It's a focus primarily on civil wars, that is conflicts inside countries about who shall rule in the country, conflicts over governments. So there's very little about territorial conflicts, and that I will come back to. And there is even less about interstate conflicts and peace building, and that I will not deal with this time, but later on we will get into that. So what I will tell you here is now what I think we know, and to some extent also what we would need to know. So the narrow path here is then to develop something which is of a lasting quality, and that means it should prevent conflicts and wars from recurring. That's the primary thing, that they shouldn't really continue or stop for a while and then again become a conflict. But there should also be some kind of quality here. That should provide for security, and also what I think is important is dignity for the inhabitants, for the people concerned. So it's not just security, which could be very repressive in nature, if you want. It could be a law and order. There has to be some other element as well, and I call it dignity. And of course, it should also be for a long-term perspective, that this seems to be a lasting condition, so that people are not expecting this to collapse at any moment. And that is, of course, important if you are going to make investments, plan for your children, etc., that you feel that this is a lasting condition. And there are a lot of challenges, as you can see here. Many do recur, some do deliver a bit of security. Most politics is very short-term electoral cycles or keeping power for the time being, and not really long-term in perspective. Now, of course, after the war, there are two kinds of situations that emerge. One is that there is a peace agreement, and we'll look at that. The other is that there is a victory. I'm going to argue that maybe there is a difference here between these two, and then that peace-building efforts then become rather different. I'm also going to argue that there is internal wars, like civil wars about government, and then there are what I call state formation wars, that is breaking up of states, creating new states, or maybe autonomies or something, territorial things within the existing states. And I'm arguing then that the peace-building challenges will be different depending on these. And those of you who know a bit about social science can immediately see that there is a hidden fourfold table behind here, but I'm not going to present it. So let's look here at the peace agreements. And here have had good help from a research assistant, Maria, who has helped me a lot to get the statistics correct. So in the Uppsala data, you can find then all the peace agreements that have been concluded since 1975 to 2010. So it's quite a lot. And here is the total number. So in this period, which still is the Cold War period, you have 28 peace agreements. Here we have 178. So it's an amazing amount of energy that's gone into trying to do peace agreements. And I would say that this is really historical. This is something we haven't really seen previously in history. And the Cold War, of course, was very much focused on winning wars rather than making agreements. So the agreements we find here are to some extent between various states, in this case very much Iran, Iraq. But in the post-Cold War, you will see then that most of the conflicts are actually about internal conflicts. These are conflicts about government. This is the typical civil war kind of situation. 139 peace agreements between parties fighting a civil war between each other. Now, if you think about it, it is quite dramatic. and that they actually can sit down and try to negotiate something. In this case, those conflicts which are about territorial issue, much fewer conflicts are dealt with through peace agreements, but still a rather substantial number. So here is a completely new historical experience. And if you think about history and about peace agreements, new orders for the world, the peace agreements we will remember are from Versailles or Vienna or something like that. These are huge agreements trying to sort out a number of problems after the World War. But here we are much more specific. This deals with particular countries and the conditions in that particular country. Of course, then, there are also victories. You can see that 32 conflicts end with some victory, at least for a period of time. Here is 45. So that's another part of the picture. You can say that there is a difference here. Peace agreements, when they fail, there will be often a new negotiation. So there will be in the same conflict a number of peace agreements. Victory is often a little more definitive. They tend to last a little longer, but that's one of the problems we will discuss. So you get a different picture here. The Cold War, much more victories than peace agreements. In the post-Cold War, many more peace agreements than victories. But both these aspects remain important. So when I start to look then at the literature here, I find that there are basically two sets of literature, and they very seldom talk to each other, which is a bit remarkable. And so what I try to do here is even do a bit of peace building here within the discipline here and see if we can get these different approaches together. You have one which I will call the Recurrence of War literature, which is focused on why do they recur, why do the conflicts come back. And these are often very statistical approaches, a lot of data. You can say that in the bottom line is the whole idea of a bottom billion. That is the formulation by Paul Collier, who used to work at the World Bank. And if you go to the latest report from the World Bank, the World Development Report 2011, which is a very interesting report, it tries to bring together a number of these statistical studies about the recurrence of war. And the approach is very much this one, that we have a set of maybe 40 or 50 countries which are the bottom billion. There's about 1 billion people living in these countries. And the conflicts tend to repeat themselves again and again. And so the formulation that Collier and others have is that this is a conflict trap. It seems like the countries are stuck in these kind of a conflicts. They have difficulties in breaking out. And of course, that means the economic development becomes skewed in various ways or non-existent. The insecurities are enormous. The quality of life are very big. Lots of refugees, a lot of people leaving. Often the more talented are leaving or the more educated are leaving. So the countries are stuck in this. That's the whole idea. That's why it is a bottom billion. And where there is even, Collier would say, even a feeling in the country that nothing is getting better here. So there is a general pessimism or sort of an expectation that we cannot really break out of this. And this is, of course, what they observe for the 1990s and the first 10 years of this century. And it is a contrast to much of the rest of the world, which has been growing quite a lot, and where the optimism, etc., is much more pronounced. And the argument is that this also then have an effect on the psychology, the mental conditions of people in the countries, that they become disillusioned and don't want to stay in the situation. So the aim of many of these studies is to find ways in which one can break out of these vicious cycles. And that's where the peace building aspect comes in. But they often don't talk about it as peace building. They talk more about it as sort of ending the recurrence of war. Then we have a separate approach, which I think some of the key terms here is the liberal peace building. And this is looking at the world in a different way. It's the same world, but they look at it in terms of international peace building experiences. What has the international community been engaged in through peace building operations of various sorts, which could be things developing out of peacekeeping operations, adding on new dimensions for the peacekeeping, taking up development concerns, humanitarian concerns, human rights issues, etc., etc. You get a rather complex kind of intervention in the countries. It's much more looking at this in terms of comparative cases. It's looking at particular cases and try to draw conclusions. It has a much stronger emphasis, I think, on political institutions. What I gave you before is much more oriented to various economic variables, and that they would argue is the key. So it takes a lot of ideas from political science or policy studies. It's still trying to search then for some kind of optimal strategies here. Typically associated with Ronald Paris, who did a book about 8-10 years ago, which has been very important. There is even in the UN a special UN Peacebuilding Commission that is entrusted with trying to do this. Very understaffed, under fairly low political influence, I would say. And there are people who are very critical to some of this, and one of them we'll hear from later on here, and Roger Mac Ginty. I'm looking forward to Roger's comments on this presentation. I'm sure we can have an interesting discussion. And there are various elements here which are important to be a bit critical about. It is a focus, perhaps, on liberal phenomenon that is often associated with market forces and democracy issues as very central in the way one tries to build peace building. So let's see, if I go through all these studies, try to see what do they say for particular phenomena, particular elements in this. And the first one is, of course, what do they say about recurrence of war? Well, it's some statistics I've tried to look at myself says that peace agreements, 14% of the conflicts that have peace agreement, you will have a new war in 3 years. And you will have 36% of them that will be sometime later, not specifying exactly how long time, but at some time later there is a recurrence. For victory, there is a little different, but not dramatically. They also do recur. If we take also into consideration that conflicts end in other ways than peace agreements and victories, they can sort of fade away for a period of time, or they can have a ceasefire agreement and so on. If we take that into consideration, we'll see that about 50% of all the conflicts recur at some time. And that, I would say, is then the challenge, that this is rather much and in a way unacceptable. And as I mentioned before, when we look at the conflicts that go on today, 90% of them have been going on for a very long period of time, and even had historically experiences of peace spells where there has been a couple of years or so without fighting, but then the fighting has returned. But I wanted to see if there was any consensus on this among different writers. So one writer says, no, victory lasts longer. That's the important finding. The next finding is that the victory, if the rebels win, lasts longer. Well, then there's another one saying, no, victory, if the government wins, then it lasts longer. And then I was just saying peace agreements last a little longer, at least after a while, if they have a chance. And maybe Walter here is the more correct one, no relationship. Maybe the victory and the peace agreement is not really the decisive element in terms of duration. It's not the important thing. But maybe there are quality difference between these two kind of outcomes. So if we take a civil war, a typical civil war where the government is disputed and the idea is to replace the government, and you get a victory, what will then happen? Well, you will see very quickly that it has particular straits, particular phases to it. One is that there will be disarmament of the loser. But military expenditure tends to remain high in these countries. The resources that are available in the country will be controlled by the winner, of course, very one-sided. And I think very significantly, outside eyes and ears tend to be closed. As there is, if the victor wins in the country, the victor tend to make sure that the international presence becomes minimal and only to the extent that it serves the government. And examples I give here is Rwanda and Angola. Rwanda is the situation after the civil war in 1994. and after a couple of years they basically closed down the international peacekeeping operation, and have of course wanted to have aid after that, but not necessarily somebody watching or looking at what happens to issues of human rights, etc. There have been elections, but when you listen to observers from these elections, you will see that there are many flaws in the way these elections are done. And similarly with Angola, the victory here is 1994, so it's now 17 years. We can see that it hasn't really opened up, but there is a bit of economic growth, that's undeniable. Angola, oil-rich country, the war ends in 2002. It takes quite a while before one has the first election in 2008, so it takes about 6 years. And in 2010, one is running a presidential election. There is an opposition party, which comes from the previous rebels that were defeated. So they are there, they are in the parliament, that's fine. But the way the whole election is done and the way the president is elected makes sure that the government will be in control for the next 10 years, according to the way one has organized the constitution. So the problem we have here in the cases of victory is really what is it that is constraining a victor? And is there anything? Well, no, the victor tends to take all. Isn't that a tune from ABBA? And we can wonder what happens to the losers. So there is a real challenge here, how to deal with victories. And even if they last, they don't, in my view, necessarily live up to the quality that you would want for a victory. If we go to the peace agreements in the same kind of type of conflict, we find that they have difficulties in conclusively ending a civil war. This is what I mentioned, the large number of peace agreements, and they tend to break down. And I looked at those where we have had real breakdowns, and it's actually 8 countries that have all about 60% of all peace agreements. So it's quite a lot. And these countries I'm listed here, and here you have the peace agreements. It's Burundi, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, El Salvador, Guatemala, Liberia, Sudan, and Uganda. Interesting, if one wants to see something positive in this peace agreement making, and the breakdown and the restart of new negotiations, and the breakdown and one restart again, maybe there is some kind of learning here, that they learn a little how to do peace agreements, but also learn what the conflicts actually are in the country and what kind of interest we actually need to incorporate to make sure that this becomes a more lasting thing. So I noticed, looking at the situation by the end of September 2011, in none of these countries were there any war. There are armed conflicts, but they are on a fairly low level. And I would argue that maybe there are some countries in this group that have a chance of breaking out, and then that the peace agreement and the way the peace building is done could be a clue to that. What you find in these kind of situations of peace building is that they of course build on agreements, they draw up constitutions, they try to share power. That is, the rebels and the government are all incorporated in some way. Fairly large governments in that sense, rather expensive, but politically it may be something that works for a period of time. They all emphasize democratic solutions and indeed have had much more of international presence, looking at these elections, much more of electoral supervision and so on than you would find in the victories. So, in a sense, there may be a chance here of finding some kind of normal politics, although the actors, of course, remain suspicious to each other. So, in a way, they are pursuing war, but now with peaceful means. There is some kind of normal politics, but under new conditions, where one is more accepting the other parties. So, if we now look at these civil war situations, whether victory or peace building through peace agreements, what seems to be important? Well, I think it's fairly clear that peacekeeping actually matters. International peacekeeping, that is. It does help to reduce violence in the situation, and that is important. Disarmament issues and what you do with the security sector, that is the military, the police, is definitely very important. And one of the key questions here is really what you do with the former combatants and what kind of occupation and so on they will have. And this is what comes out then in the World Bank report that I mentioned as a sort of a mantra. They talk about citizen security, justice, and jobs. And I think that summarizes fairly well much of the literature. It means security, maybe for peacekeeping and disarming, but justice here has much more to do with the legal system and the way it operates. I think they suggest, and maybe they have a point that fits with other writing, that is that the rule of law is more important than democracy. To establishing a situation where the government bureaucracy is built up and based on competence rather than being a party in a conflict. Difficult thing, but it seems to be important. What is in particular coming out in these studies of both natures is the commitment idea, the credibility, the credible commitment, which is borrowed from James Fearon, who wrote a very important article in the middle of the 90s about credible commitments. And in many of these writings, in different words, this comes out as the important thing, that the government really is seen to be credibly committed to this kind of a solution. And when that commitment is lacking, you also get suspicion, tension, and things may break down. And the same, of course, then for the international community, that the UN and other agencies are really there and seem to be willing to stay so that things do work out. Now let's go to the other set of conflicts, which are the much more territorial. As already mentioned, they tend to be very understudied and tend to lump everything together as civil wars or ethnic wars. But they do have rather distinct origins. And I think that's why it's unfortunate that one is putting these things together. They do represent something different. Now here is a bit of a confusion, particularly in an American audience, because you had a civil war here in the 1860s. Now, it wasn't really a civil war in the meaning here, because it was more of a territorial conflict. And the South wanted to break away and create its own state, and the North did not like that. So actually the civil war experience of the US is more relevant from these state formation conflicts. How do you bring the parties together after this kind of a conflict? It has a special history. There is often an experience of repression. There is a way of getting resources which is different because you base it on particular territories. And sometimes it can be the wealthy part that wants to break away, or sometimes it can be the poor part. One can debate that. Here are some examples from the present world: the Basque provinces in Spain, Kosovo, breaking out of Yugoslavia. Burma, Myanmar has a number of such ethnically based conflicts. India, which we regard as a good democracy, has 5 or 6 such conflicts that go on for a long period of time. Indonesia, we have East Timor, Aceh as examples, and the most recent one, Sudan, where there has been a peace agreement creating 2 states. So they are about territory. There are very few peace agreements. But it seems like if there is a peace agreement, it actually sticks. So it's something special here. It's not, you don't see the same kind of recurrence patterns here as you saw with the other kind of conflicts. And also victories are durable. So it's something more definitive that happens. And it is as if you draw a boundary between 2 actors and you stick to this. Everybody says, this is our agreement. You actually separate the actors, and that seems to work for quite a number of these conflicts. So what kind of things do we see here? Well, when I look at the victories in this kind of conflicts, so Kosovo now has its own state, Eritrea has its own state, but when you talk to people from the governments in these 2 places, they are still very uncertain, they are still very suspicious. And Kosovo, for instance, is not recognized by Serbia, and that's one of the main problems, that the former metropole is not recognizing it. The Eritreans are very skeptical about Ethiopia, but it also works the other way around. Governments, Sri Lanka, we saw a victory in 2009 over the Tamils, but again, a lot of suspicions. The Tamils are worried what will happen, even whether they supported the Tigers or not, and the government is suspicious about what the Tamils are doing. So it's not creating that secure situation that you would want. And that actually contrasts then the peace agreements, where there is a little more acceptance. Both sides have accepted what has happened, and it seems to provide much more of a feeling of security, and indeed also then the dignity factor. Now we are on our own, now we have a chance to do the things we would want to do. Some of the key issues here is, of course, that you have to draw new boundaries, and they can be soft or hard. That's the key thing. If they are drawn very hard, the new boundaries, of course, there is a danger that you create a new conflict, because there could be people that belong to the new country on the south of the border, so to say, but they are uncertain of what will happen to them north of the border, and they will be looked at with particular suspicion from the north, and the south will be in a dilemma: should we help them or not? And so the tough, hard boundaries, I think, can create new problems. So the ideal situation here would actually be if you have a sort of a regional arrangement where the borders are fairly soft, and then you broaden the possibilities of people moving back and forth, and you increase the possibility of security. So if we now generalize here, and I said this is a narrow path of peace building, so let us see if we can widen it somewhat from these experiences that I've gone through. The first one is obvious. It takes quite a long time. It's not an easy thing. The World Bank report says that it takes somewhere between 15 to 30 years after the war to really come back to where you were at the time before the war in terms of economics. But you can also say that's probably the time it takes to create institutions, to overcome a number of these wounds, so to say, that the war has left behind. Now you can ask, is an international community willing to commit for such a long time? Normally it is not. Normally one would say we will commit for a year or two. But if you look at the situation in Bosnia, where the Western world said we will commit for a year or two, now it's past 16 years since the peace agreement, and we are still there. And we still say it's necessary to be there. So in some way, there is a way of politically also accept that one has to be there for a long time. There will be tests here, surprises, unexpected things that occur, and that will then have an impact. And it will be a test to see, does it work? Can these actors now in the new situation manage this new crisis? Challenge from a new rebel group, or some challenge from the economic development that is not coming forth? Can that in some way help? Or can they manage it? That will be the test. I think then that in general there are three things that we see as significant. There has to be a development of security. Disarmament seems very important. It seems to me that the dignity comes very much through the rule of law. The fact that you can represent yourself and that you can trust a government. And indeed, what are you going to do? As I mentioned, the people that are disarmed, what are they going to do for a living? For a while the war has been the best job available, and suddenly the war is over. So the networks continue to remain there, but can one turn these networks into something more productive? Can they all start, instead of repairing weapons and armored vehicles, they can start repair shops for cars or buses, etc. So you can use some of the skills, but in principle create jobs. Seems to be an extremely important factor. Well, if we want to make this path then to peace building a little more straight, I think we need to attend to the victories. We shouldn't forget them. There is a lot of exclusion of actors taking place. There is a lot of repression. Somehow we outsiders need to think about that, not just take it for granted that this is now the new way there is. We need to think about how to do the peace agreements. That means being engaged also after the ending of the peace agreement, not forgetting it. But the key thing with the peace agreements is transparency, and also that the peace agreements are implemented. And indeed, I think one should, from this, draw the conclusion that negotiations are probably creating the better conditions. And we will then need a lot of mediation in such situations. But the important thing here is not necessarily that it should be sort of outsiders coming and do the mediation, but developing or contributing or giving experiences to a local capacity to deal with this. So that's what I would conclude. I think we also outside have a role, but I think the basic peace building will be by the actors themselves. I think we should think about us wearing moccasins rather than boots. There is a lot of talk about light footprints or heavy footprints and so on. That's the kind of footprints you get from boots that you put down, and you get too much of a mark from the international community on what's happening. So it struck me that we have some knowledge here about moccasins that are very light and don't give the kind of impressions. So maybe that's the way we should approach this. A careful way of walking through the peace building. And the international community perhaps can play a particular role in security, peacekeeping operations that I mentioned, but also perhaps in developing the rule of law, which is very much a matter of training and being supportive of this. The other main conclusion I draw from this is that we should open walls rather than the purse. Now, if you're going to get employment in war-torn societies, I think, of course, there will be a need for humanitarian assistance and also development aid to some extent. But if this is really going to work, it will have to build on the local initiatives. I think then the world around has created too many walls. And we should tear down those walls, as President Reagan said once upon a time. And the walls I'm thinking about are not just physical walls. These are the walls of tariffs that prevent trade. The European Union, for instance, has a particular responsibility because many of these conflicts are in Africa, and it's natural for people to turn to Europe to expect something. But the way Europe is protecting itself makes this very, very difficult to develop small-scale industry or even agriculture for exports and so on in Africa. And what will then be the result if we follow all these things? Well, we'll see. But I would say let's follow the developments in these countries I mentioned a couple of times. Liberia is a very interesting case. We'll see what happens. There are elections right now. My favorite, I've already indicated who that is, but we'll see. Burundi is a remarkable experience as well. These countries have had a lot of bad experiences, a lot of peace agreements, but finally maybe the conditions are ripe for these countries to really get the plunge, move forward, and be important examples for how peace building can be done. And with that, I think we have helped to make peace building a broader path and a more successful path than we have seen so far. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Well done.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to salient points, and Peter has done just that. And he has asked the right questions as well in terms of what do we really know about peace building, and what does that mean in terms of policy. And I think his comments on broadening and straightening the path to peace is extremely important, and I must say I agree with very, very much of that. The thing that I take away from it, perhaps more than anything, is now seeing Peter as a fashion guru and advising us to wear moccasins rather than boots. I'm going to restrict myself to 5 points. When Peter shared his PowerPoint presentation with me, I jotted down 18 points, so I won't kill you with that. The first point I want to make, and all of these points relate to what I suggest could be fruitful research agendas in the future for those of us interested in peace and conflict studies. The first point is to ask, who is the we in the question, what do we know about peace building? Because it strikes me, and there's a huge irony here given that I'm saying this, but it strikes me that the study of peace and conflict is hugely dominated by white males from the global north. less than 5% of articles in the leading peace and conflict journals are from scholars based in the global south. So there's a danger that our knowledge reflects a very peculiar worldview that makes perfect sense for us, but maybe may not translate very well as it travels to the global south. And it can be argued that we in the global north have a certain worldview that favours technocracy to explain conflict, but also favours technocracy in terms of the suggested policy outcomes in terms of how to deal with conflict. In a way, there's a danger that our discussions become a closed loop in which we talk to each other. And that closed loop in some way closes out indigenous voices, traditional approaches to conflict resolution and to dispute resolution. So I think there's an urgent need to widen our knowledge base and to listen to voices from the field and perhaps to look at our own academic disciplines and ask, well, should we or could we in some way think about changing the barriers that we have erected to scholarship and voices from the global south? And I do have to say that the Kroc Institution's PhD and master's programs are a wonderful step in that direction of broadening our knowledge base. The second point is to ask, is there a correlation between the declines in the number of wars and armed conflicts with peacebuilding activity? In the second slide that Peter showed, he summarized very well the number of minor armed conflicts and wars and was very optimistic, or was optimistic at least, and I share that optimism that things seem to be heading in the right direction. We seem to be containing more effectively wars and perhaps steering wars towards minor armed conflict. But the question is, did we do that? Or is it because of chance? Or is it because of the exhaustion of combatants? Or is it because of regional security complications or calculations? So I wonder, is there a research agenda, a fruitful research agenda there to see more effectively what works? Can we replicate it in other cases? My third point is to encourage us to critically interrogate what we mean by this term peacebuilding. Now, Peter rightfully put me in the category of a critical scholar of peace and conflict studies, and I'm afraid I'm legally bound to ask that question. If I don't ask that question, a labour union comes after me and says you're not being properly critical. But it is a worthwhile question to unpack this box of peacebuilding and move away from seeing it as being an undifferentiated category. I would agree with Peter's definition of peacebuilding, in which he said it was three things: to prevent conflict from recurring, to provide security and dignity, and to adopt a long-term perspective. But when translated onto the ground, it's worth asking, does much of the activity that uses this term peacebuilding actually direct its energies towards building peace? Because it strikes me from the critical perspective that a lot of the activity is actually ancillary to peacebuilding, or it's hopeful and ambitious, but actually isn't targeted, that it's sometimes not very close to the conflict transformation paradigm. So this suggests a third research agenda, and that's to separate out different types of peacebuilding. Peter rightfully separated out different types of war: civil wars, wars of state formation. But perhaps it's worth, in our further study, separating out types of peacebuilding. Because, let's be honest, some forms of peacebuilding have been securitized over the past 10, 15 years. Some types of peacebuilding are actually state building. and they don't have very much to do with peace building. There seems to me to be a difference between the two activities. Some types of peace building are much more emancipatory and patient than other types of peace building. And of course, peace building changes over time. The peace building that Bosnia needed in the immediate aftermath of the Dayton Peace Accords is very different from the peace building that it might require now. And the fourth point, also influenced by the critical lens, is to move away from thinking about peace building as something that is done exclusively over there, something that is always done in those funny, faraway countries where people look very different from ourselves. Most peace-building interventions originate in the global north, at least in terms of funding, in terms of design, in terms of the best practice that feeds into policy. And fundamentally, from my perspective, it originates in the global north in terms of the ideological underpinnings of a lot of this policy. So it's worth thinking about the peace building that can take place in our own countries if we come from the global north. And by that I mean peace building within the United Nations, within the European Union, or between the United Nations and leading states, or even within the politics and polities of leading states. In other words, I think our debates, both academic and policy, would benefit from moving on from thinking about peace building as always something that has to happen in East Timor or somewhere far flung. And the final point to make is to review what works. And here, Peter's presentation was particularly good in identifying the factors that worked. And one factor in particular struck me as being very salient, and it's one that our literature seems to have sped past at breakneck speed. And that is that peacekeeping actually works. And it's worth asking, whatever happened to peacekeeping? Of course, it works in certain circumstances. It hasn't worked in all cases, but it actually has quite a proud history. And our literature seems to have moved on from it, as well as policy attention to it. One of the most dramatic shifts in recent years has been a change in the countries that contribute peacekeepers to the United Nations. The leading contributors to UN peacekeeping, according to statistics from August of this year, were India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Egypt. Leading Western states have more or less abandoned peacekeeping. In August of August of this year, Canada contributed 17 soldiers to UN peacekeeping. I don't want to embarrass this audience, but let me put it this way. Canada is a superpower in terms of the number of troops it contributes to the UN compared to this country. And I have to say that the UK and Germany, etc., contribute extremely low numbers of UN peacekeeping troops. Now, clearly there's a wider story relating to the legitimacy and the status of the UN. But I think it's really worthwhile for our literature doing a U-turn and going back and looking to see what peacekeeping can tell us. What were the lessons from then, and can we integrate any of it into our praxis at the moment? But my final point is simply to thank Peter, because it's a real gift and a real skill to cut through this huge literature and to say something that is so accessible and is full of so many salient points. So thank you very much, Peter.
Good, thank you. We have about 15 or 20 minutes for conversation. I will give Peter 2 or 3 of those if he wants to make any brief responses to Roger's 5 points, and then we'll open it up for conversation. And I will throw one question in for both Roger and Peter. Peter, they can take up or ignore as they choose to see fit. Roger's last comment about what works and Peter's prior one about peacekeeping. I found both of you more positive and optimistic about the record of peacekeeping than my impression would lead me to conclude. So the way to one way to frame the question is, I remember reviewing William Shawcross's book, Digitalization, that reviewed peacekeeping as of about 8 or 9 years ago. It was a pretty devastating account of mismanagement, of blue helmets that are targets more than enforcers, of, as you mentioned in the end, lack of any kind of equity in terms of provision of forces for peacekeeping. I would not have, at that point at least, described peacekeeping as something that works. But so I'd like to hear the counterexamples where you give me the 3 worst cases and the 3 best cases, if you will, so that such a strong emphasis on the side of peacekeeping from the UN or elsewhere can stand up to that question. So you can take that in the course of your response if you want, Peter, and Roger can respond to it, and then we'll open it up.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Roger. These were really very interesting points. And let me just talk about the peacekeeping. I mean, what the recent studies show is that the peacekeepers are often sent to the worst situations. So they're not coming to easy situations. So if you take that into account, that they come to rather difficult kind of situations, the likelihood of success is probably rather small. And if they still manage to do something, then it is meaningful. But I think Roger's point is absolutely correct. There is something strange that has happened here, that peacekeeping now is a way in which poor countries go to other poor countries and try to sort things out. You can see it's a sort of a solidarity in a way, but it is also a financial thing. You are paid to do this, and the payment is often done to the central government, not to the soldiers on the ground, and so you get all kinds of problems with that. I think it is absolutely odd that the rich countries, including Sweden, a journalist called me and asked, how many peacekeeping operations are we in Sweden? And I said, no, we are in none, because all the soldiers we have are in Afghanistan, except some who are flying airplanes above Libya, or some that are in a little fleet outside Somalia. So there is really very little taking place. And this is sort of shocking, because the image is that we are contributing a lot to peacekeeping, and we are actually not. So the ideal solution here, I'll take Liberia as my favorite case again, is that you have countries from the south, but that the north provides some of the technology, for instance, that is not available. So the way one had it in Liberia was that there was a separate what was called a sort of intervention force, and that was the Swedish force. There was also an Italian like that. It meant that they had stronger vehicles that could drive fairly quickly when there is a dispute somewhere. They could come there and look rather impressive, and the troubles die down. Actually, they normally died down before the troops were there, because they were so noisy, so people could hear that here the Swedes are coming, so you better. So that's the way peacekeeping could work, as a sort of a combination here. And it's definitely been a problem in Darfur, for instance, where the Sudanese government actually prevented this kind of a force from being there. So definitely I need to go into this. There are clearly in the 90s some very bad examples where the peacekeepers were not very successful. But again, if one look at them, Rwanda is maybe the typical case where the peacekeepers were in place, and they were sticking to a mandate that was given to them by the Security Council. And that was that they were supposed to watch the border between Uganda and Rwanda. And here is a genocide taking place, but they do not get a changed mandate to actually try to stop the genocide. Then when they still want to do, the Boutros Ghali still wanted to do something about it, and he contacted the American administration and said, we need some armored cars here. Can't you help us with them? And the Americans say, Clinton's administration says, yes, you can get some of those cars, but you have to pay for them. And of course, the UN does not have any money to pay for them. The US was absolutely reluctant even to have American registered vehicles coming in there to do something about it. So again, the thing comes back a little to how the peacekeeping operation is run and who decides about it. And so then we come back to the north, many of the times. And I think that's really a very, very important point that Roger makes. These are not just things taking place in faraway places. The kind of intervention or the kind of support is decided here, very close to us. And that's where our debate is extremely important. So let me stop there, but I think this is an important discussion that we definitely could pursue here at the Kroc Institute, and maybe invite a little more about people who have studied particularly the peacekeeping operations.
Great. I'm going to open it. You want to say anything?
No.
Good. Thanks. You read me right there. Professor Philpott.
Thank you. So Peter, as you probably know, my colleague at Harvard, Monica Toft, argues almost the opposite. Mm-hmm. She thinks that peace is only likely to last if you have victory in a civil war. Mm-hmm. Now, she thinks victory is not enough. You've got to have things like security sector reform and so forth, but you've got to have victory. Mm-hmm. And she argues that without victory, I mean, you can see the logic. These parties have been fighting, willing to die for their cause. At least one party has settled for less than their cause, less than what they want, maybe because of the intervention of an outside power or something. One would think that if they're that willing to die for their cause, they're probably likely to wait in the wings until troops leave or what have you, and then take up arms again. And we do know that negotiated settlements do break down with a strong frequency. So, anyway, what's your response to that?
Yeah, of course, I quoted her here also. So I think that's an important work. There is a book and there is an article in International Security, which definitely are worthwhile reading. When I looked at the cases, many of these victory cases were actually what I would call state formation conflicts, where you actually created two separate states. And when you do that, actually, even with a peace agreement, things become very different than when it is in a civil war. But she doesn't really look at the cases. She looks a little too much, I think, on the statistics. And when you start to go down, you will see that there are some interesting discrepancies here. But my argument in general would be the quality. It would be that, yes, you can have a victory which seems to last for a long period of time, but I don't think it will provide for the kind of transparency and the possibility for a democratic development, and that the peace agreements are stronger in the long term in terms of quality, not necessarily in terms of how long the peace lasts. Even with a victor, of course, you can see that the losers start to think, what are we going to do now? And maybe they will regroup in some way, find another alliance, somebody that can help them, and the war could very well restart there as well. So the dynamics are there for both kinds of conflicts. So approximately like that, I would argue.
Yes, please, Mary Ellen.
Thank you both very much. I found both presentations extremely interesting and important. Maybe I'll start with Roger. I fully concur with your view on peacekeeping. In my own work, I found that the first 17 peacekeeping missions before the Cold War were generally very successful. But they, of course, went forward on the classic peacekeeping doctrine, ceasefire, consent, self-defense. That's a model we should definitely return to. It's cheaper and it's effective. It's when we tried to push peacekeeping into peace enforcement without the resources, with wrong mandates, in very dangerous situations where countries were losing lots of soldiers. This very important method for keeping the peace began to break down and got the bad name that Scott talked about. But I also liked your point about focusing on self a little more. We in the North, being scholars of the North, maybe we should look at ourselves before we're so focused on others and what we can do. And what I found, especially in the UK, this move toward a more militaristic attitude toward international relations, and in a way having a bad effect on the United States. So for example, when we got this funny idea to invade Iraq in 2003, I often ask myself if we would have gone if the British had not said it was okay, that there was a good international law argument for going, that we would have really been alone in the world, because of course the Australians came because the UK came. And maybe that would have given us some second thoughts. So, you know, I'm just wondering, and now we've seen more recently this enthusiasm for military force as opposed to alternatives, and I'm wondering if there isn't something people encouraged or thinking about peace building shouldn't do to change from this generalized. I was just at a meeting on counterterrorism, and a former legal advisor in the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, is very enthusiastic about targeted killing of terrorist suspects like the Al-Awlaki killing last week. And this seems to be a general view in the UK. This is perfectly fine. The US, you go for it, you send those drones. So I'm just wondering about what you are doing probably personally to build greater peace attitude in the UK, and maybe that'll help us. For Peter, really a similar question. You know, Roger talked about focusing on self, and I was thinking about all the things you're looking at, but I didn't see anything about intervention in civil wars. And we know from the cases that you showed us this very interesting set of countries that have these constant turnover, Chad, Ivory Coast, those are also associated with many, many interventions by the French. You saw Guatemala and El Salvador, interventions by the US, Somalia. The US pushed Ethiopia into intervening. Sudan, we have African Union and other countries intervening in these conflicts militarily in a non-classical peacekeeping way. And I would add myself the Kosovo intervention, the Libya intervention. Are you looking at how external intervention is exacerbating as opposed to creating greater peace? And since it is so often by these countries in the West and the North, isn't that also an answer to Roger? Isn't this a place where we should be looking?
I'm in an uncomfortable position of having to agree completely with a questioner. And as a critical scholar, I'm deeply uncomfortable. So I agree on peacekeeping. The difficulty with peacekeeping was that it was presented mission impossible, and of course it failed. And you're absolutely right, it did go back to basics. And the absolutely crucial point about peacekeeping was that it was impartial. And we seem to live in a world in which political partiality and the securitization and the politicization of a lot of peace building seems to be the watchword. Hence, peacekeeping seems out of favor with global circumstances. Your comments on the political situation in the UK and the gung-ho nature of politics there are actually quite intriguing, because I think a lot of people in the UK would actually say that politics in the UK follows the US, and the gung-ho nature came from here. I think there are a number of points to make. In a way, what could be called the liberal militancy of the past decade was to a certain extent cost-free for a number of political leaders. In many ways, and I know that you work on this academically, the conflict in Libya has had absolutely no British or French casualties. And I think that has to be enormously salient and significant. We saw in the case of 2006 when Israel and Hezbollah were fighting, Israel was really defeated by its own public opinion in many ways. It was defeated. It showed in a way how a democracy really cannot take a large number of casualties. So in many ways, some of the wars that we've seen in the past decade are cost-free. They're things that we watch on television to a certain extent. But in the back of my mind, there's something that's saying, I wonder, are we living through the last hurrah of this liberal militancy? Because at some stage, China is going to move beyond its serial abstention in the UN. At some stage, it's going to, I think, become much more vocal in who calls the shots in terms of international reaction. And also, we can't forget about the other members of the BRICS as well. So I do wonder, are we living in the last hurrah of liberal militancy, and we're moving towards a new era which will be much more uncertain than the uncertain times that we're living in?
Yeah, a quick comment. I mean, I agree with what you say. And just to illustrate the complexities, in Côte d'Ivoire, which is an interesting case, you have a peacekeeping operation by the UN. At the same time, you have a French force present there. And I interviewed the person, the UN representative there, and he had no idea what the French were doing. According to the mandate, they were supposed to inform him, and he tried to go to them and get information, but they were running their own agenda. And indeed, they were part of the way the whole conflict ended. So that's another of the complexities, that these peacekeeping operations are still fairly small, they are transparent, and there are other actors there who have their own designs. The ideal peacekeeping operation, I think you're right, one should maybe go back to the original way one was thinking about this, to a sort of very neutral kind of operations. I sometimes think that what we should talk about is police keeping, that they actually have a sort of a police function and trying to sort out local problems. But the problem is that we don't have police that can be sent. All police is busy, but the military is not necessarily busy, so you can send them. But they're not trained for these kind of operations often. And the training, which is really fascinating to see, for instance, the US training, which is very much a war-winning philosophy, and the Swedish military training, which is much more sort of policing rather than war-winning. So you need to think here what kind of people you are sending in here, and you call it peacekeeping, but maybe they are trained to do something else. The other point, which Roger mentioned, is very interesting, and that is with China. The Chinese now are saying that they are great in favor of peacekeeping, and the Chinese troops now are sent out, and they are trying to learn a lot about this. So it would be very interesting to see, what kind of approach are they taking, and what kind of conflicts do they show up in, because we are in a very interesting world, going through a fairly Western world, where now East Asia will take a completely new role and maybe have completely different approaches.
We'll take one question from the students before we adjourn. I say we'll take one question from the students.
Hello. You mentioned the lack of the participation by Western countries, powerful countries, in peacekeeping missions. Why is that? Is there any reason? Are there reasons behind that? Political, economic reasons, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's quite clear that the forces are being used in various wars rather than in peacekeeping. And the American troops are being involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Europeans are also, particularly in Afghanistan, but also in other places. So what we saw during the 90s, for instance, one of the peace dividends was actually a reduction of military expenditure, particularly in Europe, but partly also in the US. In the US, it reversed from about 2001, and it has increased, but Europe has not increased in the same way. So there is simply very few troops, and the priorities are political priorities, and the priority is, we should be in Afghanistan. And which is not so easy to explain to the Swedish public. I mean, why on earth are Swedish soldiers dying in Afghanistan? Is this some kind of a sort of general approach here? Are we going to sort of balance or attack Russia from there because Russia is our main problem? or why do we have these people out there? It's not easy to explain. And the government explains that this is a peacekeeping operation that we are doing. But it isn't. It is not a peacekeeping operation. It is taking sides in the conflict rather than having this neutral position. So I think it's simply a matter of troops not being available for these other operations. But you can say also it goes back to political decision. The Swedish government could say, for instance, or the Canadian government could say, okay, we are not interested in being in Afghanistan. Now we think it's more important to try to do something with Somalia or Darfur or something like that. So it also comes back to a political decision that is taken here for the way we see that our resources should be used. So it becomes a debate in Sweden, in Britain, or in the US as well.
Any final questions?
Can I add a tiny point to that? And that's I agree completely. I think there's something else as well that explains why peacekeeping is overlooked, and that is ambition. And in a way, there's absolutely nothing wrong with ambition, but I think a lot of leading states have gone beyond their own capability. And now, rather than saying, let's just stop the fighting, they've moved towards a full service notion that as well as stopping fighting, they should engage in a much more extensive campaign of nation building, state building, reconstruction, and therein lies, of course, a number of traps and pitfalls.
Okay, please.
I was wondering, because most of the speakers and in the comment you were talking about that probably we should go to the concept of peacekeeping that was previously so-called 6.5 chapter peacekeeping. But I wonder, because the main aim was monitoring the ceasefire and coming only with a parties agreement. If we will take our hands out of the situation where something extreme is happening, probably these operations are not so successful because we give them too much weight and we are asking too much of them. But still, what we will do with this operation, we will stay out and say that these peacekeeping operations are not effective. That's why we will not do anything in these cases, because we will not want to undermine the image of peacekeeping, or we should somehow develop these peacekeeping operations in order to be able to address these kind of situations.
Before you, for 1 second, I should have asked you both to introduce yourselves. Please, where you're from, tell them where you're from.
Maria Gavrilova, I'm first year MA student from Russia, specializing in peace studies.
My name is Alwat Hamoudi. I'm from Algeria. I'm a student, specialized in studies as well.
Thank you both. Okay, quick response.
Yeah. I mentioned that Maria helped me do the statistics here, so I'm very grateful to Maria, and I of course agree with everything you say. So. But it is true that the old concept built on the ceasefire idea, and that one would be in there to make sure parties were keeping the ceasefire, and that would give a chance for negotiations. That was the basic idea. I think there is something to that idea still. Maybe one should still have that idea. Okay, we are coming in, we will help you out, but first get a ceasefire of some sort here. We don't want to go into a situation where you're still fighting, and that could actually be a way of putting some pressure on the parties to scale down their conflict, and then we will come in. So there are various ways in which you can look at this.
Okay. So thank you all. Thank our speakers, please.